Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Since this keynote is both part of our bigger workshop and conference on iconographies of the Holocaust, visual representations and migrating materialities of war and genocide since 1945, and a public event, I will take the liberty to again briefly introduce Carol Young for those, Carol Gluck, I'm sorry, for those who are not, sorry. The bugs keep coming in with this. Okay. For those who are not specialists on East Asia, because for those experts we wouldn't need this introduction. So Carol Gluck is George Sansom Professor of History at Columbia University. She specializes in modern Japan from the late 19th century to the present, on international relations, World War II and history writing, and public memory in Asia and the West. And as she has told us earlier this day, actually the upsetting parts of memory, politics and discussions turned Carol into a memory scholar from a historian, because there were interventions that she luckily stepped in to do. But she's also a member of our advisory board. I'm the head of a project dealing with globalized memorial museums, exhibiting atrocities in the era of claims for moral universals, which is based in Vienna at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And Carol, as well as a few others who are joining us at this conference, are in our advisory board. So I can say beyond the usual that Carol is not only very famous for East Asian scholars, but also very down to earth and incredibly supportive as an advisory board member, who immediately answers every email, even congratulates me for my birthday and all these things that one would never expect. We really appreciate your advice, and please, the floor is yours. We will hear about the memory on the move, the comfort women and post-Holocaust pasts. Please, Carol.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be introduced as Carol Young. I don't know if James is here, but that's an honor. So that's fine. Makes me feel good. I have a bad cold. I can't hear and I can't talk very well, so please forgive me for my voice. I'm delighted to be able to be part of this conference, even if I'm masquerading under somewhat false pretenses here. I did really enjoy reading these wonderful papers, and it really made me feel the full force of words like traveling, transnational, and restless memories. Terms that have been building over the past several decades in the field, ever-expanding field, I should say, of memory studies. And during the second half of the 20th century, a set of memory practices, politics, attitudes, and expectations evolved into a kind of global memory culture, much of it emerging through memories of the Second World War, particularly of the Holocaust. So here I want to use the comfort women, the sex slaves of the Imperial Japanese Army in wartime East and Southeast Asia, as an instance through which to view the way public memory moves, or the ways in which public memory moves, mobilized and mobile, across time and space. And I want to do that in 4 aspects, which are slightly different, each of them, in approach. The first has to do with what I call the operations of memory, to show how the comfort women actually moved into public memory for the first time in the 1990s. The second are circles of memory, about how different agents, memory activists, interacted, sometimes in cooperation, often in contestation, to create this movement into public memory. And third, restive memory, how the now famous statues of the comfort women transited the globe as migrating materialities, part of our title, cloaked with local meaning. And fourth, the global memory culture itself, how the norms of this moving memory of the comfort women reflected and refracted memory practices originally related to the Holocaust. Finally, a word about the afterlives of comfort women memory and what they have to say about the future of post-Holocaust pasts. So let me start with operations of memory and just methodologically tell you how I proceed in terms of paying attention to three particulars when I'm looking for the movement of memory. The first, and the memory I'm looking for is predominantly war memory, okay? Memory of the Second World War. I pay attention to these three things. First are what I call chronopolitics, which is a fancy way of saying simply the effect of the chronology of politics, both domestic and international, that affect national memories of the war. Differences in chronopolitics are what explain the diverse course of memories of the war in post-war West Germany and Japan. Differences in chronopolitics also explain why the memories of the Second World War are today a most vexed topic in Eastern Europe and East Asia, and not in Western Europe. And the reason is that both East Asia and Eastern Europe confronted their war narratives anew after the end of the Cold War. Second thing that I pay attention to are the terrains through which memory is expressed. Obviously, the official or government terrain, and what I call the vernacular terrain, a word that's come up quite often, but which I use to refer to both the consumption of memory in popular culture, media, popular culture, and also the production of memory by memory activists in civil society. They all work in the vernacular terrain. And this terrain, you won't be surprised to learn, is where most of memory change happens, where a lot of the movement happens. After the vernacular past, which is so central, there is the personal past, which is a mixture of individual memories and socially available stories, and which is affected by something I call the effability factor, the utterability factor. What a person, the ability to speak out, what a person is willing or able to say about a traumatic past. A last terrain is the terrain of meta-memory, through which people learn about memory debates without themselves being involved in them. This is very often from the media or news reportage or reportage, that kind of thing. So those are the four terrains of memory. And the last thing, the third thing I pay attention to is the vectors of memory that reveal the directionality of memory change. In other words, where does it come from? And I found that change or movement in public war memory, which is always insistently national in every country and insists on national unity as well, it's a single story, tends to come from outside the nation, whether in geopolitics or international opinion, and from below. That is to say, from that complex civil society of memory activists of every political and experiential stripe who challenge the national narrative from which they often feel excluded, which is the reason for the challenges. So those are the things that I keep in mind, and with those things in mind, here's an outline of how the comfort women moved into public memory in the 1990s. I'd have to start with breaking the silence, because the comfort women were never a secret. Japanese knew about them. It was mentioned in the national parliament, in the newspapers, not a secret. But a combination of things kept the comfort women out of the public memory commons. Early on is what I call familiarity blindness, when in the War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo after the end of the war, the Allies did not prosecute the comfort women system, largely because military brothels were familiar and accepted. So the comfort women remained invisible in that legal context. In Korea, it was patriarchal views of chastity and purity. In China, the views of sexuality were sometimes called victim blaming and slut shaming, plus the Chinese overwhelming emphasis on Japanese atrocities against the nation, not necessarily against, certainly not against women. And in the Philippines, for example, Catholic notions of morality kept the women from speaking up. Because obviously there's a different kind of a shame there, right? So for numbers of reasons, in addition, I should add the affability factor. These women did not speak until they were very old and wanted to tell their stories before they died, and also in a context that had changed so that people were ready to listen to their stories and help them seek justice so long deferred. When they spoke up, first time 3 South Korean comfort women came out and told their stories in public in December of 1991, August of 1991, and again across Asia in December of 1991. And the question is, how did that happen? How was it that they could come forward after nearly 50 years in all of the countries involved, and there were 10 or 11 countries from which comfort women, including Japan, from which comfort women were recruited or coerced. And here, the process of the movement has to do with the convergence of factors that were neither predicted nor controlled. These included, for example, political democratization in South Korea in the late 1980s. That's domestic chronopolitics. You could say things in Korea that you couldn't have said before under the dictatorship. Growing feminist concerns with sex tourism and trafficking in East and Southeast Asia, which had become a larger problem from the 70s on. These are memory activists in the vernacular terrain. Post-colonial anger at Japan's imperialist and wartime oppression of Korea, again, vernacular terrain. And then the willingness of elderly women to break their silence. This is the personal past in a social context of people willing to listen. Then there was the post-Cold War pressure from Asian nations on Japan. This is geopolitical chronopolitics. The Asian nations pushing on Japan to confront and acknowledge Japanese wartime actions in Asia and Southeast Asia, and not simply dwell, as they had for so long under American tutelage, on the war against the United States in the Pacific. In other words, this is the war in Asia. This is China and Southeast Asia. Japan's occupation went all the way, as you know, from the middle of the Pacific to the borders of India. So this is a geopolitical pressure. At the same time, Japanese activists, who had long been active but with no one listening, made common cause now with their Asian counterparts, and that was a signal difference, to focus on the plight of the surviving comfort women, the women themselves. And here was the vectors from outside and below, from below within Japanese society, but in conjunction with the activists outside. The rape camps in Bosnia during the war in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s brought sexual violence to the fore amid increasing international attention to the human rights of women, symbolized by the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference, and continually addressed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, vectors from outside again. And there were also changes in international criminal law regarding rape and sexual violence as weapons of war. This is on the official terrain. This is actually law. Again, and at the same time, identity politics among North American, Asian Americans, and Asian Canadians, and particularly Asian Americans, took up the comfort women issue subsequently, similar diasporas did in other countries, memory activists, bringing the issue into public prominence in the media, vernacular terrain, and eventually in the US Congress and other parliaments, condemning the Japanese reluctance to confront the wartime past. So here the official terrain. The Japanese government's steadfast and vehement rejection of any coercion of these young girls into sex slavery fanned the flames of memory, proving that the uses of denial have considerable power in keeping the memory moving, in this case from the denial on the official terrain. In Tokyo in 2000, there was a so-called, not so-called, this is the title, Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's Military Sex Slavery, which brought comfort women from all across Asia, of course didn't know one another, as witnesses in a high-profile people's tribunal with prosecutors and judges from all over the world, some of them from the former, the tribunals of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And this tribunal in 2001 found Japanese leaders, including the emperor, guilty of war crimes, memory activism. Now, there were more factors involved than I've listed, but I hope you can see from these that the memory of the comfort women moved in multiple orbits. This is multiple movements, right? With ricocheting velocity and with diverse goals and motivations. The result was that the brutal suffering of tens of thousands of young women across wartime Asia became a widely traveling trope for sexual violence against women in wartime, just as the Holocaust became a traveling trope for genocide across those decades. It had taken, wrote a leading Japanese feminist, 50 years to change the shame of women into the crime of men. In answer to Ron's question, who moved the memory, I'd like to talk about the circles of memory, because these are the agents responsible for these multiple movements, both within societies and across nations. Now, these are memory activists who, just to give you a simple definition, the one I use, include any group, primarily but not always outside the state, that seeks to influence the prevailing narratives of particular pasts, whether by correction or revision or expansion or inclusion. That's the definition. And their combined convergences, or cacophonies, as it might be a better word, can prove decisive in changing public memory. I'd like to oversimplify again and situate the memory activists involved in the comfort women issue in 5 circles of memory. In the first circle were the victims and their advocates, and this is the earliest circle as well, who initially brought the issue to wider public attention. So after the first Korean women told their stories in 91, scores of others followed in other countries, very often because they heard about the earlier stories being told. We have the woman in the Philippines who said, I heard on the radio that, and then I thought, well, maybe it's all right. Another one said, my husband is dead, I can talk now. But so this was an effect, actually one story being told leading to others across Asia. The women who told their stories produced a powerful evidentiary record of the comfort women system, as it's called, in which they had been ensnared. Now in 1990, which is the year before they came forward, the Koreans, a Korean organization mobilized on behalf of these women, primarily in terms of sex trafficking and sex tourism and trafficking. And they called themselves the Korean Council for the Women Drafted for Military Slavery. And the reason that matters is because the term used in Korean is the term used for forced labor. So this was a colonial term. This is not about gender. This is about the oppression of Koreans, including women, during the imperial period and during the war. At the same time, Japanese lawyers, scholars, feminists, and journalists continued to raise their voices, but now they had reverberations and resonances elsewhere, for the former comfort women demanding compensation from the Japanese government, an apology, as well as official recognition by the Japanese government of Japan's responsibility for the comfort women system. Now, the emergence in the 1990s of what has since become to be called the Comfort Women Redress Movement, which is an international, transnational movement, occurred primarily in regional context first. It's South Korea and Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, where former comfort women came forward and local organizations formed to support them in their quest for recognition and justice. Their cause, and this is important, often included protests against present discrimination against women in their societies, whether in the form of patriarchy, sexual shaming, or systemic androcentrism, which is a favorite Korean word for male-dominated thinking, right? That's the first circle. The second circle, and they are very different. The second circle was international activists, professionally and personally committed to advocating for the human rights of women, a phrase that is a 90s version of women's human rights, the human rights of women. Having learned about the comfort women from the public work of Asian activists, legal scholars, jurists, feminists, and human rights organizations in the West and other places identified the comfort women as an egregious example of the violations of women's rights in the past that they were seeking to address in the present, including trafficking and sexual violence. In the mid and late 1990s, investigative reports by the International Commission of Jurists, and who have nothing to do with Asia, okay? This is a European-based, basically. And two separate United Nations rapporteurs were among the first to use the term wartime slaves and sexual slaves to describe the comfort women. Now, this is a term to which the Japanese government still vociferously objects. But note that it comes from outside. It really did come from these international reports. And it stuck, much to the Japanese government's chagrin. Now, rape was first prosecuted as a war crime in the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which began their task at the same time in the early 90s. The comfort women, and this is of signal importance, the comfort women in quotations, were mentioned in nearly every legal argument for making rape a crime against humanity, because the international jurists knew about them, and they used that issue all the time. And indeed, in 1998, in the statute for the International Criminal Court, rape, which is as old or older than human history, was for the first time legally designated a crime against humanity. So this circle of memory revolved around international and transnational human rights discourse, the United Nations, and international law. Asia and the former comfort women were less a focus of present redress than an example of the outrages committed against women in the past, which were to be prevented now and in the future. The third circle was different again. Here, the agents of mobile memory were the diasporas in action. Initially Asian Americans and Canadians, but following that, others in Australia, in Germany and other places. Most North American participants in the redress movement were second and third generation post-memory Korean Americans. They were not themselves immigrants. This is a post-memory. And these Asian Americans lobbied for congressional resolutions calling for Japan to recognize and compensate the surviving comfort women. They worked to communicate the testimonies of the comfort women across their own countries, often accompanying some of the elderly women on these tours that they would organize for them. And they helped to erect comfort women memorials in their communities. Now, the background for this is actually ethnic politics, primarily in the United States in the 1990s, combined with a growing electoral significance of Asian Americans, particularly in places like California, but not only. And that lent political potency to the advocacy or to the activism around the comfort women issue, such that one of the leading sponsors for many of these comfort women initiatives, including the congressional resolution of 2007, was a Japanese American congressman from Northern California. Because his constituency, I mean, he's Japanese American, but his constituency was filled with Chinese and Korean Americans. So there is a political, an ethnic political question behind some of this potency here. In San Francisco, it's interesting, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and even Japanese Americans worked together to create a Comfort Women Memorial in San Francisco, succeeding against the forceful intervention of the Japanese government in Japan. And the city of Osaka broke off a long-standing sister city relationship with San Francisco. None of that deterred these people. But the point is, they're working together. This is Asian Americans working together. And in Southern California, that was in 2017. In Southern California, Armenian Americans joined the Korean American cause in what was called an inter-ethnic victimhood alliance, seeing in the Comfort Women an example of injustice that evoked the atrocities that had been visited on their own people in the Armenian genocide of 2015. So these are cross-ethnic for different reasons, right? In fact, well, as an aside, when the Glendale, California statue was defaced again in 2019, the mayor of Glendale stood up for the statue, and he was an Armenian American, and this was 6 years after the statue was established. In any case, it's the role of these diasporic memory activists, many of them women, who work primarily in local, regional, national, and to some extent international context, but motivated more by their own local and national concerns. Motivated by those concerns much more than they were concerned with conditions in present-day Asia. So they weren't really thinking so much about what was going on in Asia today, or even what went on in Asia in the past, so much as their efforts to repair the injustices to their ethnic forebears. I mean, it was an ethnic identity question. The fourth circle, I don't know, you could label this, I do label this just the arena of memory politics, not because the other circles were not political, they were all political, but to point to the expanded role of memory in national and international politics that occurred during these last decades. Gradually over time, memory becomes more and more prominent, a political issue. Governments, opinion leaders, civil society organizations, advocates, and denialists both tended to invoke the national past to foster domestic unity or to support a regime or party in power, wielding history as a weapon in domestic and also in foreign relations. This is the memory politics story. Political leaders in China and South Korea made Japan's history problem, diagnosed as such in the 90s, a pillar of regional geopolitics, which it remains to this day. It doesn't matter whether Korea or South Korea or China are addressing Japan's national or nationalistic textbooks, or they're addressing territorial disputes about these islands in the waters between these countries. The comfort women comes up as an instrument of diplomatic or political menace, let's call it that. It's not really negotiation in this case. So it's politics. And in 2015, this politics came to one of many heads, I would say, when this was the 70th anniversary of the end of the war, which is always a heightened issue, particularly in Asia, not only, but so in 2015, you had officials in the United States, Germany, and other countries pressuring both Japan and South Korea, and I really like this phrase, to put the past behind them, which is where I thought it always was, but this was the word of Secretary of State John Kerry, for the sake of East Asia security. The instrumental use of history for national, patriotic, and populist purposes, we all know now, is increasingly prominent. Russia, Poland, Turkey, Hungary, China, India, the United States, and so on. And then again, that World War II focus that I mentioned in East Asia and Eastern Europe. So the comfort women became a geopolitical issue between the countries, between Japan and Korea, between Japan and China, to some extent between Japan and the Philippines. And these agents of memory in this circle, the fourth circle of memory, were less motivated by the violation of women's rights. I mean, really? Not surprised to learn that. Or even the plight of the former comfort women, than by the use of the past for national unity and political, nationalistic often, political interest. Now the fifth circle is the space of global memory, where tropes traveled as if unmoored, and they travel now as if without quite the agents behind them, as if unmoored from their historical time and place. It's not quite the same thing as memories crossing national borders. It was more like the shedding of historical context in favor of abstract principles or values. The memory activists in this circle, however diverse, and they were, tended to present the comfort women primarily as an instance in the violation of the rights of women, sexual violence, wartime rape, and trafficking, often either avowing or implying the universality of the principles transgressed by such offenses. So there was an abstraction, if you like, of the suffering of the comfort women into these universal, often, principles as they argued them. And like slavery itself, which some once thought acceptable, in the process of this abstraction, if you like, military brothels came to be deemed immoral, illegal, and criminal in the context of contemporary views of human rights. And military brothels involving, obviously, coercion. That was argued on an abstract basis. That wasn't argued in terms of the comfort women rights, the comfort women system of the Japanese. And this is what became the main traveling trope, as I said. That's the sexual violence against women in wartime. The refusal of the Japanese government to admit coercion and wrongdoing was significant but secondary. And the colonial context, which was so important to South Korean memory, was often remote, unmentioned, or even unknown in a lot of these arguments about comfort women in a global context. They couldn't care less about or know much about the colonial experience, 45 years of it, 10 to 45, 35 years of it, 35 years of colonial rule by Japan, by Japan of Korea. So they're working in different ways. And this last circle is really a circle that is working in terms of abstract values and principles, primarily in terms of the human rights of women. Now I'm going to just do that. Oh, near. Oh, no, I realize it's not. He showed me how to do it. I got it. I'm slow on the. Okay, so there's the circles of memory. The 5 circles of memory that I've separated here for schematic purposes, of course, were connected. I mean, there's no, and I think advocates for comfort women and for the redress movement have, for good reason, been called activists beyond borders, transboundary activists, transnational redress movements, because they work together to great effect. There's no question. 15 Asian Solidarity conferences were held between 1992 and 2018. This last had 200 participants from 11 countries in Asia and the West. So it really was activists beyond borders. The transnational network also caused what has been called a boomerang influence. Its message returning to Japan and changing Japanese views of the comfort women. Actually creating Japanese views of the comfort women, if you like. Popular culture, again, the vernacular terrain, and public opinion polls showed that most Japanese now thought that the comfort women system was wrong and that some amends should be made to what is always called Japan, the neighboring countries, East Asia primarily. Now, the media coverage of many of the testimonies, controversies, and debates, this is in the terrain of meta-memory, made it almost impossible for most Japanese not to know about the comfort women. I mean, it was just all over the place, especially in the 90s. And the boomerang actually hit home. Japanese public opinion changed, and continued denials by the government only did more to spread that knowledge. So that you could argue that the Japanese government and right-wing nationalists were memory activists too, producing a domestic boomerang of their own, which absolutely backfired, if you like. All this being said, I want to close the circles of memory section by saying the transnational activism was not always a force for good, in my view. Agents of memory were, not surprisingly, anchored in their own place and naturally focused on whatever aspect they felt most strongly about. Some South Korean activists, for example, resist the view of the comfort women issue as a traveling trope in global memory because they object to the universalization of sexual violence because it seemed to ignore the original colonial context that produced the oppression. And for them to lose the post-colonial specificity was to lose the larger subjugation of Koreans under Japanese imperialist rule, which was the larger context for the brutality visited on the comfort women. But to activists working in international law and human rights, such an emphasis on colonial, post-colonial issues could often appear parochial and unhelpful in their efforts to work for the rights of women everywhere to be safe from sexual violence. And while rape has been described as a transcultural memorial form, an example perhaps of restless memory that crosses borders and creates solidarity, it could also lead to a competition among victims, which diluted the common cause of seeking gender justice. If the colonial moment is more important than the gender justice, then the international legal community was disturbed by this provincialization, if you like, or this historical provincialization of the issue. Now, feminists also didn't agree with one another. And there's a lot to be said here, but I won't say too much. One point of contention set gender against nation. There was one famous interchange at the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995 when a resident Korean scholar, resident in Japan, charged Japan's leading feminist and activist with complicity in the comfort women system because she was Japanese. The citizen of the perpetrator state. Okay. That Japanese feminist responded by calling for a cosmopolitan feminism that transcended nationalism, a position to which the Koreans responded by saying that no Japanese activist could escape the legacy of imperialist feminism. So here's nation over gender. Right. Feminists also argued about prostitution, are asserting the difference between the comfort women as sex workers or as sex slaves. On the Japanese left, the distinction treated the agency of women working in the sex industry as a separate category from comfort women who had been dragooned or coerced into service. On the Japanese right, they labeled all comfort women as prostitutes who voluntarily entered the brothels, thus relieving the Japanese military of responsibility. The feminist distinction between prostitutes and sex slaves, between sex workers and sex slaves, appeared in malign form in the circle of memory politics, particularly when nationalism rose to new peaks again in Japan and South Korea in the teens, in the 2010s, with the comfort women issue central to official geopolitics in a way that it hadn't been for about 15 or more years. Domestic politics, it's chronopolitics again, and resurgent nationalisms were the main reasons this happened in 2015. The geopolitical weaponization, as I mentioned, of comfort women memory. And by 2015 and ever since, it seems that many Koreans, including Koreans in civil society, prefer to claim that all comfort women were forced into service as young girls, while Japanese officials insist that all comfort women were either prostitutes or volunteers. Neither claim is true. Some women were coerced, and some were not. Some were deceived by false offers of employment, and some signed up to aid their impoverished families. Some were prostitutes. Some were recruited by Japanese, and a number by Korean civilian middlemen, which the Korean viewpoint does not want to acknowledge, by Korean middlemen. And of course, not all comfort women were Korean either. I mean, it's very important to understand that of these tens of thousands, the number is disputed, but let's call it tens and tens of thousands, there were comfort women from all over Asia, including some Dutch comfort women in the Indies, in Indonesia. So these were, and this is equal opportunity brutalizing, if you like. So it's not just South Korea, though that's where the geopolitics is the most heated. The former comfort women and their advocacy organizations in Taiwan, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia pursued similar goals as those in South Korea, but without that level of hostility and that level of geopolitical presence. The nationalistic blinders, as far as I'm concerned, I often write about how this is a case of two countries behaving badly. Both South Korea and Japan are behaving badly, the officials, on this issue. Now, this wasn't in the level of the people in the memory, in the circles of memory, in the activists. This wasn't intentional because they really did try to take care of the former comfort women, the surviving comfort women. And they are now dying out. But that's what they tried to do. And in the process of the circles of memory interacting or overlapping and sometimes opposing one another. And the fact that the comfort women were dying out, they were already elderly in the 1990s. There were only a few left, really a handful left. Probably by the end of this year, there won't be any left, I think. No, before the end of this year. In any case, the point is that in the course of this, you had to ask yourself, well, with all this noise about the comfort women, all this advocacy, all this activism, where were the comfort women themselves? The aged and dying former comfort women. I mean, their voices have been crucial in providing the evidence for the comfort women's system in their testimonies and public appearances, which were very difficult, emotional, and often angry. These were not easy stories to tell. As victims, they demanded recognition, compensation, and apology, and they appeared with their supporters at the demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul that began in 1992 and continue today. But while many of them, even when there were many of them still alive, the voices of their advocates began to swell louder than theirs, as they became what one writer about the Holocaust calls moral witnesses, speaking on behalf of global victims, which is a common phenomenon in transnational memory, actually. So nearly all the comfort women activists embraced and cared for them so-called Korean grandmas, Filipino lolas, these are the nicknames, grandmas, lolas, Taiwanese amas. So they were doing their best, and yet by 2020, a very feisty 91-year-old South Korean former comfort woman complained that the main Korean advocacy organization on behalf of the comfort women was exploiting them and treating them like bears doing tricks. It was very strong. That's very strong language. I mean, it may not sound, but it is strong. And using donations to the organization for its own rather than the cause of the comfort women. And not one to give up the same woman at 93, organized a collective petition to the United Nations to pressure the Japanese and South Korean governments to take the comfort women cause to the international case, to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. But it was evidence of the takeover, if you like, of the issue from the surviving comfort women and their families. So even in that first circle of comfort women and their advocates, they could be working at cross purposes, right? And as important as these transnational networks were, the agents of memory could also be blinkered, as I've suggested, working within national, often nationalistic borders, ethnic boundaries, pursuing ends with means that could be used for purposes other than their own, as happened to the debate over sex slavery versus prostitution. That simply left the whole comfort women's system behind in terms of the, if you like, memory justice. And they often appealed to the comfort women issue to advance other causes, whether they were lofty like international gender justice or local like ethnic identity politics in the United States. So in conclusion to the circles of memory, I would say 2 cheers for transnational activism. Now the third aspect, called restive memory, I'm quoting a scholar, has to do with the comfort women statues. Because the knowledge and acknowledgement of the experience of the comfort women had traveled widely in the 1990s and the 2000s. And in the 2010s, those expressions were joined by the so-called statues of peace that transited the world as migrating materialities, for sure, a restive memory which has since become the main figure, if you like, in the iconography of the comfort women. And so it's my third aspect of memory on the move, the statues themselves. Now there are museums as well, 9 of them at last count. The first in South Korea in 1998, others in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and China, where one opened in 2015 in an actual former comfort women's station in Nanjing. And I think I can There it is. So this was a former Comfort Women's station that has been turned into a museum. There are also memorials with plaques. The first one in the United States was unveiled in New Jersey in 2012. And there are many works of visual, I'm not dealing with them, but there are many works of visual arts, photography, plays, films, and novels in a number of languages. This story appears in all kinds of representational media. But it's the statues, I think, that have become the main material mover of the Comfort Women memory. Now, the first statue of, what did I say we did this? Yeah. The first statue of peace, in Korean, the literal title is Statue of Young Girls for Peace, was erected in 2011 in Seoul in front of the Japanese embassy. Right in front of the Japanese embassy, all right? And it was done on the occasion of the 1000th Wednesday demonstration in 2011. Now it's a statue, as you can see, of a young girl seated in a chair, looking determined, her fists slightly clenched, a bird on her shoulder, which is said to suggest her spirit or her feistiness, if you like. Next to her is an empty chair that no one really knows what that's for, actually. People are divided about that. But it has to do with the other Comfort Women who are there, not who are absent, so to speak. And then beneath that is, you see the shadow on the stone beneath it? That represents the elderly Comfort Women who came forward. Okay. In cold weather, people put wool caps and scarves around them in winter, right? And they put flowers. This is from the back. You can see the flowers, but what you're seeing is the Japanese embassy police presence, because that's in front of the Japanese embassy. It's been a thorn in the side, as you can imagine, to the Japanese government. Actually, in 2015, when they made an agreement when South Korea and Japan made an agreement that was described by the two foreign ministers as final and irreversible, most of us laughed. The Japanese foreign minister tried to get the South Korean foreign minister to promise to remove the statue. It wasn't in the agreement, but it leaked out, and South Korean public went crazy, right? We're not going to remove the statue. So again, the officials had the boomerang effect. In any case, so this is a view of one of the Wednesday demonstrations behind, and you can see that now a lot of the people are younger because there are very few Comfort Women left to be at the Wednesday demonstrations. And here's another example in Seoul. They'd made 500 miniature Comfort Women with the name of each of them. It was an installation there. That's a better photo of it in 2017. So everybody knows what this girl looks like in South Korea for sure. And it's hard, actually, not to feel drawn to her. I mean, that's what people say, and that's the affective point. That's where the emotional effect comes in. It's not necessarily as aggressive as you see the wall of tears. You see the tears coming down in front of this is the Comfort Women statue in front of the Nanjing Museum, and I don't have a photo, but in the Nanjing Museum there's a bust of a Comfort Woman that has water running down it, and you are invited to wipe the tears off her face. And there are towels available for that purpose. So this is actually a tearjerker, if you like, but that's not the normal. The normal view is you look at this young maiden, this young girl, this young innocent girl, dressed in Korean dress, with hair cut only as young girls wear their hair. And you don't know why, but you feel something, and that seems to work. Now, replicas of the Statue of Peace are now found around the world, with the largest number, obviously, in South Korea, at least 6 in the United States, others in Canada, Australia, China, and Germany. Some, such as those in Manila, let me show you these first. Southfield, Michigan, there you go. Gwangju, this is South Korea, but not a replica. You see this, see the butterfly? That's another iconic representation of the comfort women. This is in Germany, in some little town in the middle of nowhere, in 2017, bundled up for the German winter. And this is Manila. The statues in Manila, Atlanta, and a few other places were installed but then removed under pressure from the Japanese government. Very often a combination of pressure from the Japanese government and from the national government that didn't want to have trouble with Japan. That's what happened in Manila. It was really the president of Manila that joined forces with the Japanese government, president of the Philippines, that joined forces with the Japanese government and said it's got to go. And so she's not there anymore. We also have some, we don't know where they are. Some have been removed and we're not sure where they are. There's somewhere, there's one in British Columbia, which is now hidden in a garden, things like that. Because, you know, the Japanese government routinely objects, and very vocally and very publicly, to every statue. Now, the one in Berlin, which in Berlin Mitte, right in the middle of Berlin, was objected to, but they've held their ground. It's still there. Now there's a little comfort women museum right close to it. In fact, the Japanese government protests have proved, as far as I can see, to be a nearly fail-safe statue-creating foreign policy. As soon as the government of Japan objects to one statue, another statue goes up somewhere else. And this has been going on since 2010. So again, they are memory activists on behalf of the comfort women. It drives them crazy. I cannot explain to you. I have been followed by the thought police, even when I'm not lecturing on the comfort women. There's one of those guys from the consulate, nearby consulate, whether it's from Edinburgh if I'm in St. Andrews, or whether it's from Atlanta when I'm in North Carolina, and they're ready with their first question, which is not a question but a statement, just like in the 1930s with the thought police. I now expect them, and I've been really good at wiping the floor with them, I have to say. I know so much more. They don't do a lot of research, these consul generals. But anyway, the point is that they are serious about their objection. They have not stopped, even under the present prime minister, who is not as nationalistic as the former one. In any case, some of the statues are variations on a theme. This is Shanghai, 2016, and you see there's a Chinese comfort woman and a Japanese comfort woman. A Chinese and a Korean comfort women, in their respective native dresses. And then the San Francisco 2017 one is a very unusual one. It has 3 comfort women, a Filipino comfort woman, a Korean comfort woman, and a Chinese comfort woman. And the standing statue on the ground is a statue of the first South Korean comfort woman that came forward in 1991, Kim Hak-sun, who really had the primary, or the first, let's say, the first courage to do that. These are unusual. The iconic figure is still the seated girl, whose semiotics has been criticized from left and right. The criticism from the right is largely from the Japanese government, Japanese Americans or Japanese Australians and other diasporas, and their supporters, including one Tony Morano, known as Texas Daddy, to right-wing Japanese circles. He's just a supporter. You can find him on YouTube. Exactly what he's about, I don't know, but they do, some of the Japanese Americans do have supporters of the anti-comfort women. The criticism from the left is different, obviously. It's feminist and or anti-nationalistic. Sorry about my voice. The feminists regard, or some feminists regard the seated figure as depicting the perfect victim, representing purity, chastity, and otherwise reinforcing patriarchal stereotypes of women. They also point out, and this is a point well taken, that the comfort women are presented either as innocent young maidens or as elderly grandmothers, occluding the long decades of the survivors' lives between the end of the war and the time they came forward in the 1990s, which actually maintains and even reinforces the long social silence they had endured. I mean, there's nothing of their lives in the middle, even though in their testimonies they do talk about that. They talk about the difficulty in getting married, not being able to have children, all of these things of how they lived. But in the iconography, they're either pure young maidens or they're elderly grandmothers, old elderly women. And that's true. The criticism of the nationalistic question, I mean, there's little doubt that in Korea and in China, too, the girl represents the wrong done to the nation. There's just no question. It's not the wrong done to the gender, it's the wrong done to the nation, where the female body once again becomes a synecdoche for the national body. So there's been then a global transit of the comfort women statues, but their meanings are always quite local. I think this is true of a lot of memory that travels. The localization begins with the motivations of the activists in the communities that erect the statues. Korean Americans are the motive force behind many of the U.S. statues, although often the community cooperates, as they did in San Francisco and Glendale, California. The Korean Germans, or as they put it, we are a German-speaking, I quote, group interested in the history and culture of Korea. They are the ones who put up the statue in Berlin. They're just trying to argue that it's not simply a Korean diaspora. There are others that, interested in the history and culture of Korea. But Germany is different. They talk in German, as you know, about a post-migrant society. That kind of talk doesn't happen in the U.S. With the Asian American supporters. The statue in Glendale, California, which was 2013, earliest actually, the earliest replica, was erected by the Korean American Forum of California with support of the City Council. A suit was initiated against the city of Glendale by the Global Alliance for Historical Truth, U.S. Cooperation. And with a name like that, it's the Japanese right wing, because they're the ones that have the monopoly on historical truth, right? The U.S. Supreme Court threw the case out in 2017. But as I mentioned before, the statue has been vandalized, the most recently in 2019. And most of this vandalization reflects local prejudices and local squabbles. It doesn't represent, okay. I don't have my watch, but how much time do I have?
We have 25 minutes until we have to leave. Okay, well
then I will go more quickly and tell you. So the point is that these statues are viewed in local context. Here's one example. These are photographs of Indonesian comfort women, and the exhibit done by Dutch photographer that was traveled to Indonesia, Japan, and the Netherlands. And the result was differently interpreted in the three places. For the Dutch, it was their family memories of their life in the Indies, either before or after Japanese occupation. For the Indonesians, it was all tied up with the suppressed memory of the massacres of 1965. And in Japan, where they added the documents that proved the Japanese government was involved in the comfort women's system, it was all about an anti-Japanese government thing. And they're the same photographs. All right. So my last, and I'll have to do this quickly, my last aspect has to do with global memory culture. And I'm sure you know where this is going, so I can do it quickly. These are 5 characteristics of the comfort women of the global memory culture, I guess you would say, that exemplified in the comfort women, and all of them owe a lot to the memory of the Holocaust. So really quickly, in the realm of law, the War Crimes Tribunal, particularly the Eichmann trial, that began to make victims as central as perpetrators. Without that victim-centered justice, the comfort women would never have had a chance, okay? In the international law, I mentioned the ICC statute. A lot of that comes out of similar kinds of concerns about international law against genocide, against sovereign immunity, etc. Civil trials, also in the law. The comfort women modeled their class action suits in the 90s against the Japanese governments in U.S., Japanese and Korean courts on the Holocaust trials for the Holocaust, for different aspects of the Holocaust insurance and forced labor, etc., in the 90s. So, and even the so-called radiating effects of failed suits had an important effect on comfort women memory. So law was important, and it was a Holocaust model. Testimony, clearly, without the comfort women testimony, there would have been no evidence. There isn't. This is sexual rape. People don't write about it, even when they're not under Japanese military force. And there's no documentation that there was covered up or destroyed. So without the voices of the victims, without testimony, without all those written memoirs, taped memoirs, video memoirs, VR testimonies of Holocaust victims, this wouldn't have happened. And the reason that this is so important is because it's really the age of the witness that we are said to live in really represents an epistemological change in how we know the past. We now are admitting truth to testimony, even if there's no documentation. And that's what happened with the comfort women. Enough people told their stories. They were corroborative enough, and everybody except the Japanese government believed them. So that was, the testimony was definitely a result of that, what was going on before, particularly in the 90s, though, at the same time. Third, in the realm of rights, the comfort women demanded the same kinds of rights that that Holocaust survivors and the post-memory generations demanded. They demanded recognition, they demanded compensation, they demanded education for the next generation, right? Never again, never forget. And these kinds of civil rights, they come out of that. It's a pattern that you see repeated, but not a pattern that was there in the 1970s. It's really a product of time. The fourth is in the realm of politics, and here I've just mentioned that the issue, the way this has become a political issue, the expectation that governments should apologize to their own people or to other governments, something unthinkable in the 1950s, where, and now expected that there is a politics of apology, if you like, or a politics of recognition, which is why I can promise you the Japanese government will apologize yet again and again for the comfort women. And then last, the fifth one is in the global memory culture, it has to do with the realm of responsibility. And that's the change from assigning responsibility at the beginning to demonic leaders, moving to organizational men, moving to ordinary men, moving to almost everyone. This idea of the citizenry responsible in some way for these kinds of things, that has had a big effect, and that comes from the Holocaust. So this is what Lily calls the Holocaust template. Holocaust memory created the template. The Asian comfort women did not consciously follow it. It was just, to use James's word yesterday, in the air. It was in the zeitgeist, if you like. And so that's how clearly I think the relation between the comfort women and the Holocaust memory. And then just finally, 3 short points. What do you do with the afterlives of the memory of the Holocaust? The first problem is, what do you do beyond living memory? Because it's fading everywhere. That's a problem. And the Holocaust, the comfort women don't have post generations. They don't have post memory the way the Holocaust survivors have had, or even those who didn't survive, right? So that's the first question. The second one is that memory will not stand still. It will keep moving. What will become of the comfort women statues? Will people put wool caps on them and scarves in the winter? Will they connect this virginal girl to repeated rape and violence? It seems unlikely, actually. So banalization, normalization, neutralization, all those words are used. And UNESCO doesn't help, because UNESCO has helped in the comfort women question, too, of embedding these questions in amber, and they can never change. Heritage is now fixed. And so the continued moving is, I think, the issue here. And then the obstacles to the past being remembered are, in the case of the comfort women, primarily nationalism. There's no question, nationalisms. And secondly, the profound stickiness of gender norms. There is no question that the gender norms in these East Asian societies have not shifted, and that makes it very difficult for women in East Asia to deal with. I mean, it's true everywhere, dealing with sexual violence is not easy, even for men. It's not easy to cope with the idea and the reality of genocide either, as we know today, or anti-Semitism. So memory keeps on moving. There are traces of the past, which is why palimpsest is a metaphor of choice for memory studies. So lastly, about memory studies, what is our task, our mission? You already know that I consider myself a memory activist, trying to make public memory more responsible, truer to history, in the name of, not of the past, but the future. And when I think of what our obligation is to the post-Holocaust pasts, I think we now know what James suggested yesterday, which is that never again most likely means ever again. So that our work has to relate, in my view, as much to the way memory is on the move now, in the present, as it does to the actual memory of the past. And I think here there's a lot we can do in understanding how the Holocaust figures in our global collective memory and how we can be true to it now and in the future. Thank you. Sorry to be so long.
Thank you so much, Carol, for broadening, deepening, and complexifying what we have discussed so far in the conference. I think it's amazing how you brought together everything that the conference encompasses: the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian genocide, and how the sexual violence comes together in that when the comfort women are involved. This was an amazing bringing together everything that actually is the topic of our conference. I will drop my questions and open the discussion. Is it okay for you if we collect? Because we only have 15 minutes left. Sure. Okay. Wow, okay. Zuzza, then Marketa, then Ran, and then Simone and Maria. Okay.
Is there a microphone?
You need a microphone.
Yeah, I can grab it.
Turn it on.
Because they're recording, so we need a microphone.
I left my notes behind, but I think I know what I wanted to say. I found it incredibly interesting when you spoke about those tensions between comfort women and activist networks, especially when they are international activist networks, and how those people in Korea, for instance, reclaimed the colonial dimension to this experience, and how this was challenged by this universalizing aspect when it was post-colonial versus gendered, but actually why not speak about or think about it in terms of intersectionality, so then we don't have either or. And also because you say that it was the Holocaust in all 5 points that constituted a frame to for this trope to become a global. But I was wondering, also coming back to the colonial and post-colonial, that in the US, but also in other contexts, it was the 70s and the 80s and later that the indigenous communities and aboriginal communities started claiming and reclaiming first their land, then their objects, their rights, and also human remains in the process. So I'm wondering whether this is also not part of this process, and this going back and reclaiming the colonial and post-colonial dimension of comfort women is not also part of another entanglement.
Okay. Want to wait till the others?
Yeah, let's have 3 maybe. So you can pass on the mic to Simone, but Marketa first and then Ran. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Carol, for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. When I listened to your lecture in 2021 in one of our jurisdictions of our institute, it inspired me to go deeper on the so-called comfort women movement in the case of People's Republic of China. And I have a lot of questions. but I'm gonna actually stick to that. So I was wondering, how do you see China formally joining the transnational movement in 2014, 15, 16? How does that impacted on the different levels, on the different circles of memory regarding the movement? And that also brings me to another thing that happened in that time period, which is the Voices of the Comfort Women as an application to the Memory of the World Register. And I'm actually wondering if there was actually a resolution to it, because at first it was rejected, then UNESCO was supposed to give a decision, then it postponed it up till, that was 2017, and I've been really trying to figure out what has happened to the decision. So I'm wondering if there was actually any decision, or if the silence is a decision itself. So also, where does UNESCO stand in those different circles? And I have other questions, but I'll leave it here. Thank you.
You have enough for one more?
Well, I can start quickly. I'll try
Yeah.
to be quick. You can see I'm not very quick, but I'll try to be quick. The post-colonial, I would argue that the actual post-colonial, including the word, where are you, Susanna? Including the word intersectionality, has not really made a dent in these circles. Korea is not post-colonial in the same way that India is, right? And gender, the intersectionality of, both your class and gender and nationality hasn't really, and the reason, I think, is, in a word, Korean nationalism. In other words, it's not a post-colonial retelling of Korean history without trying to get beyond, beneath, and transcend colonialism. It's not that at all. So they're not there yet. Secondly, Japan is only slowly becoming post-imperial now. They never had to become post-imperial under the Japanese-American alliance, which only began to be pressured from Asia in the really late 80s and 90s. So you don't have a post-imperial metropole either. So I would say the colonial, it really isn't POCO yet, post-colonial. Which is an interesting phenomenon, which I have to think about exactly how that happens. And people really aren't reclaiming. It's so nationalistic. I mean, what people are reclaiming, the Koreans are reclaiming that mountain up there as the site of the original Korean god. The Chinese are saying, no, that's our mountain. That's where we are, okay? So that's my answer to that. This is, and I'm not saying this is chronologically, it's just different, okay? And maybe that's one reason why we don't, well, anyway, I'll stop there. And then, Marquetta, China's interesting because it's a small handful of, on the one hand, there's a small handful of activists who've made those museums. And transnational activists. The Nanjing Museum was made with a Japanese activist, an American, and they brought a former comfort woman from North Korea because she had been at that comfort women station. But it's a very small, it's not widespread. Two reasons. First of all, when the comfort women are mentioned in the Nanjing Memorial Museum, it's really about the humiliation to the nation. I mean, it's about, it's not as gendered in the presentation. It has to do with the Nanjing massacre and a third reason, and the reason for that is what I said before, is that what really is the center of war memory for China in the last 30 years, since the 90s, is Japanese atrocities perpetrated on the nation and humiliating the nation. So atrocities, ungendered atrocities, including the comfort women, but not so gendered. And the last reason is the Chinese government doesn't like this issue. They don't, it's not like Korea, where they use this issue all the time. Very often the Chinese government will pull back from this. They don't use it in diplomacy. They did in the late 90s, but they haven't really recently. So there isn't that, national thing. As for UNESCO, no, there's no decision. It's because the Japanese intervened and said, we're going to take our money away from UNESCO if you proceed with the comfort women voices of the world. And so then they wanted the Japanese back, so now the Japanese are giving them money again, and they've created, I don't know how many subcommittees, but we're not there yet. Now, the last, application for comfort women for the status, UNESCO status, was actually multi-country. They got together and said, okay, if it's not, we all feel the same way about it. And still, it hasn't happened yet. And that's partly because, not partly, it's Japanese government. It's a money thing, right? Because Japanese government does pay a good portion of UNESCO. So no, it's still in limbo. And there are a lot of people in the UNESCO side who want to keep it there. I can't prophesy. They say they're working on it, but it's been 8 years. A long time. So you didn't find the decision because there isn't one.
Okay, I see a lot of discussion between you two coming in the reception. Let's have Ron. No.
Very short comment and short question. First comment about the maiden trope. It's also connected to Hiroshima. There were the atomic bomb maidens that were in the 50s. That also a group of Polish women that were given particular same treatment at the same time by the same kind of group of people. Normal cousins, others. So the maiden trope is, especially in the Asian context, I think there's a triangulation here. And then a question I want to ask about, you talked about evidence and testimony. And I wonder what's the role of Japanese historians like Yoshiaki and others in vis-a-vis the testimonies. How does it work together, and what if there is any tension between documents?
Okay, so the historian that you talked about is very heroic. Already in 1992, he went into the archives and he found documents that showed the Japanese military was involved in the comfort women system. We now have documents that show that there was involvement. And Yoshimi has done a lot of work in that regard, but the documentation is scant and easy to contest because it's scant. But it's the testimonies from all these people. This is a group of elderly, often lower class, some of them illiterate women across Asia who didn't know one another. Think of what they accomplished. And they accomplished it because they and their advocates were able to get their stories out. So it's the testimonies that made this happen. But it helped that you had historians like Yoshimi who showed at least that you can't deny that there was a comfort women system. So instead, the Japanese government denies coercion, doesn't deny the system. So that's their line now. They were all coerced. They were all voluntary. They deny coercion. I'm expecting that to change under this new prime minister, but he's trying so hard to stay in office that he hasn't got time for this. Because that was the last prime minister's firm assertion, Abe, that there was no coercion. They were all prostitutes or voluntary. So they said there was a system, but there wasn't coerced. People joined the system. That's how they dealt with the documentation. Oh, well, that's a whole different issue. That's the Texas guy. They just happen to be scholars. There's a lot of debate about this. But the debate, frankly, the right-wing debate hasn't got a chance. I don't think so, not over time. I don't know what'll happen, but the denial isn't going to work. And that's why I'm sure that the Japanese government apologized in 1992, okay? Right away. Famous Kono statement. So this is all domestic, this is chronopolitics through and through. When this party falls from power, or this coalition falls, they started apologizing when that dominant party fell in 2009. They made apology tours throughout Asia, so we know what's going to happen. This is completely domestic politics. So it's not going to. The denial will, the apologies will come and the official denials will stop. Meantime, the guy in Texas can go on, making YouTube videos.
Okay, Simone and Maria, maybe we collect again.
Thank you. Carol, thanks so much for that lecture. I was just wondering about the Indonesian comfort women.
Mm-hmm.
Has that factored much into your research, and also looking at what I think may have started out as a kind of Holocaust template is actually more regional, insofar as the Netherlands and its historical commissions investigating the the Dutch East Indies and the Japanese, and also because of there were Dutch women forced into slavery there as well. But I'm just reading that there were trials there in Dutch Indonesia in 1948, played host to public trials concerning the internment of Dutch women, and they resulted in the conviction of high-ranking Japanese officers, and they decided to abandon these trials in favour of a Cold War strategy, so to speak. So how does Indonesia...
It's a little bit more, it's a little more malign than that.
Okay.
There was one, as you say, Simone, there was one trial that involved the comfort women's system. It was in Batavia then, in Jakarta, of the comfort system, women's system in Indonesia. But the defendants were white Dutch women, not a single Indonesian. It was a trial where it was a race question, not more than it was a gender question, or it was a race and gender question. And Indonesian women, it never came into question. Okay, so and the one woman who was a defendant, who since died but recently, was very active in the Comfort Women Transnational Network all through the 90s. Jan Ruff O'Hearn, living in Australia, for many years. In any case, it took a lot of work and a chronopolitical change. You had the new order of Suharto had to fall. The same problem in 1965. I mean, Indonesian memory was suppressed, not just the comfort women, but so it took until really the 21st century, and then you began to get people who are looking into this. But it's a small group. A small group of people looking into it. They've done some really good work, but the comfort women do not have the prominent place in public memory. But it's interesting because, and anomalous, if you like, because there were some, I don't know how many, 700,000, huge numbers of people, of forced laborers under Indonesia. The Indies were under occupation for nearly 4 years by Japanese, and it was a very direct and invasive occupation. There were these Romusha who are forced laborers, and you would think, judging from war memory around the world, that the Romusha, who are much far greater in the forced laborers, in far greater number than the comfort women, but they don't have much in Indonesian public memory of the war. What is the main narrative in Indonesian public memory of the war? Yes. Independence 2 days after surrender. So this is a post-colonial narrative that World War II not brought, but enabled independence. And so the forced laborers in hundreds of thousands, the comfort women, egregious in smaller numbers, they're not there. And now the big memory issue really is 65, not now. So that's chronopolitics. It's not unusual for the colonies when these nations become independent, that World War II, that's how the narrative goes. Okay? And so that's a reason.
Okay, Maria, final question.
Okay, thank you so much. It was a fascinating lecture. And my question is about, let's say, this Holocaust template part, and about circles of memory as well. So when you were talking about this influence of this victim-focused and testimony-focused, let's say, memory, which is modeled by the Holocaust in the context of comfort women remembrance, I was thinking about differences immediately.
Mm-hmm.
One thing came to my mind when listening for this earlier part of your lecture, when you mentioned that these voices of advocates are often louder than of the victims as testimony givers themselves, and that, if I remember well, moral witnesses speak on behalf of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering what would be your comment on that? Is this something that happens to the Holocaust victims as well, or maybe it's one of the points where the difference somehow turns out?
Well, I can only answer in the context of the scholar who wrote about that, Carolyn Dean, about the Holocaust. That's what she claims. And I can't comment on how true that was of the Holocaust. She's got some very good convincing examples there, actually. I think that one big difference, Marie, is that, as I said before, there are no post-generation, there's no post-memory here, right? There are very few left, very few left. And there were very few even in the 90s. I mean, we were talking hundreds, not, So they never had the kind of social presence. So it was probably a historical difference that it was going to be easier for the moral witnesses to take over, because you don't have the families, you don't have post-memory, you don't have people tattooing their father's number on their arms. So I think it's more that than it is. I think there is a tendency, and I cannot prove this, I think there is a tendency in some of this transnational memory work to arrogate to oneself the subject position, not of the comfort women, but the subject position of the agency for the redress movement. That's all I'm saying. And that surely happened here. So I think the difference has to do with the nature and number and extent, if you like, of the two issues. I don't think the Holocaust and comfort women are comparable in any way. I just think that in terms of memory templates and patterns of memory, that they are not comparable, but they are linked. Okay.
Thank you so much. I guess there is a reception now happening outside, and we see each other then also later after the reception. 6:35 is the shuttle for the conference participants. Thank you.
Thank
you so much.